Hello and welcome to our bite-sized sessions on useful models and concepts that could support your CIPS revision process. Today's session takes the form of an interview and we'll be exploring the theory surrounding whole life asset management and its impact upon procurement and supply chain. So can you tell me what whole life asset management is all about?
Yeah, thank you. Whole life asset management is all about the impact or the consequences of buying, owning, and then ultimately disposing of a particular asset in its life. Sometimes it's referred to as cradle to grave. And it's about thinking about the full life cycle that we would have when we buy something.
Why is this relevant for procurement?
Yeah, well, it is actually super important. I think traditionally you could see procurement looking at particularly perhaps the price of something or just looking at the initial acquisition. But we know even from our day-to-day lives that sometimes if we only focus, for example, on price and just get the cheapest thing, perhaps that's not the best in the long run. So from a procurement point of view, we're wanting to take a more strategic approach to acquiring anything. And that's thinking about through not just how do we get this and how much does it cost in the first place, but then we're thinking about the duration of its life. So how will it be operated? What are the impacts of that? How much will that cost to run the item? And then finally, that last phase is how do we get rid of it? How are we going to decommission it or dispose or repurpose the item that we're looking to buy?
Isn't this just the same as the total cost of ownership?
Well, that's really a good question, that is, because total cost of ownership, you're right, is very similar. And sometimes people use those words synonymously, but it's not quite. Total cost of ownership is focusing on the cost. So that's the cost of acquiring, the cost of owning and operating, and the cost of getting rid of. Whole life asset management is subtly bigger and more important than that. Yes, costs are a factor, but there are also other considerations. You take, for example, the environment or even the impacts on society. So this is about the concept of ESG. We need to consider the impact of any asset in its life cycle in terms of the environmental impact or its impact upon people just as much as cost. So total cost of ownership, or TCO, focuses purely on cost. And then you have other terms like whole life costing. Again, that is the same as total cost of ownership. Or life cycle costing, which could be taken in a carbon footprint perspective just as much as cost. But the term whole life asset management is about all considerations through the whole life of that asset.
What are the biggest challenges of measuring whole life asset management?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because it's not quite as simple as the theories suggest. So you've heard quite possibly of the Priceberg concept. This is the concept where perhaps, like an iceberg, you have this very small pinnacle of ice sticking above a waterline, which we can all see. So, for example, we can all see the price of an asset when we're going to buy something, like you see the price of a car or you see the price of a computer printer. What we don't get to see is all of the other costs that perhaps sit below the waterline. So like that iceberg, you don't see the mass of the ice or most of the costs that sit below that waterline. So when we're coming to measure whole life asset management, we're having to make some assumptions and some estimates about its life. So for example, one of the guesses will be, what's the duration? How can we lock this down and make a decision on the calculations? How much will each year cost in terms of maintenance or operating or running the asset? Then it comes to getting rid of the item, and it's got to be decommissioned and disposed of. and there may be some various environmental or wastage regulations to comply with, or things might have changed between now and that future time. So the challenge of whole life asset management is one of measurement and trying to be precise around assumptions on the future.
So what's the takeaway when studying for this subject?
Yeah, okay, for a CIPS learner, just remember that whole life asset management is super important, and CIPS has got a lot of focus on it. You need to understand the three main focuses that whole life asset management have. So that's the initial acquisition. How much does something cost? What are the costs to us of obtaining the item? You need to understand what it means to own and operate an item and what costs could go into that. And then in particular, and this is a really important focus that CIPS has of late, the end of life considerations. What are we doing to get rid of, and in particular the environmental, sometimes also the social implications of getting rid of something that we've bought. So those three phases are really important for a CIPS student.
I hope you enjoyed this session, and thank you for watching.